Hi, I'm Myra Peabody Gossens. I have been a Jubilee Housing volunteer since the early 80s, former board chair and now board member Emerita. And in celebration of Jubilee Housing's 50th anniversary, I have the joy, absolute joy today of connecting with a longtime friend and very important person in Jubilee Housing's history, and that's Bob Boulter. How you doing today, Bob?
Fine, Myra. It's great to chat with you.
It always is. And I just in preparing for this conversation, you brought back so many wonderful memories. So it's going to be wonderful to share all of that. Bob, you joined the Jubilee Housing in a leadership role only 5 years after Jubilee Housing was founded. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But I think it's really important for people to know who you are right now. You are someone who has had a through thread in your life of service to people. And what you're doing right now is very connected to Jubilee Housing. And we'll go back to the history in a minute, but tell us a little bit about FaithWorks and what you're doing right now.
Well, FaithWorks was created quite a few years ago now. We founded it in 2021. I'm sorry, 2001. And it grew out of Jubilee Enterprise, which is what followed my launching into this work at Jubilee Housing. So what FaithWorks does is come alongside churches and faith-based ministries that want to do something with housing or community development, but haven't had experience with that. So we're able, because of the experience I had at Jubilee Housing and then Jubilee Enterprise, to help churches and faith-based groups do affordable housing and related community facilities.
And you're in Winchester.
That's where our office is based. This is the area is called the Northern Shenandoah Valley. So there's 5 counties around Winchester, and it's in the beautiful mountains of Virginia.
Nice. Not too far from Washington.
No, it's only about
So
an hour
where
and
did you
15
grow
minutes.
up? Where did you grow up, Bob?
Well, I was born in Washington, D.C. at George Washington University Hospital, and my dad had a business in D.C., and our church that we went to from the time I was born was in Washington, D.C. But our family lived in Northern Virginia. My first home was in Arlington and then Falls Church in Fairfax County.
And how was it growing up in DC back then?
It was beautiful. I mean, I still have memories. We would cross the 14th Street Bridge right there by National Airport, and my parents reminded me for a few years, you used to say the United States of America, the capital of the United States, as we would go from Virginia into DC.
Right, right.
Weekly.
I think there's a wonderful story that you shared with me recently about the trajectory of your life and heading off to Princeton. And then some things happened that I'd love for you to share with your mom and with some life decisions you were making. And tell us a little bit about that time.
Well, now we're really getting personal.
Yes, we are.
As I grew up, as I said, we went to church in Washington, D.C. It was a Mount Vernon Place Methodist church, 18 years before Methodist became United. And it was a large church that drew families to it from Virginia, Maryland, and D.C. So, and people from all walks of life. It was an amazing place to be connected with many families in different situations. I can still remember in that big church looking across the street to what were just some row houses, and they were actually affordable in those days, although it was a beautiful part of the city. And remembering the people that were sitting out on the steps of those row houses across from Mount Vernon Place Church that would be drinking or just enjoying the Sunday morning or afternoon. So, and then, as I say, we lived in Arlington, which was just outside of DC, right near the Army-Navy Country Club. And I can remember there was a fence out behind the place where we lived, and sometimes golf balls would literally come across that fence over into our backyard.
Right.
So it was quite an environment. My dad, as I say, worked in DC, And that's another part of the story. It was a wonderful early life for me.
And you decided to go to Princeton to study what?
Well, that was an interesting development. I ended up at Princeton, and I was started out to study engineering and that sort of thing because I'd done well in math and science, but figured out pretty quickly that that was not where my heart was. So what I did was shift to a special program that was actually more related to social things, and did very well in that. I was there 2 years, and that put me at 1968. And I can still remember being in my dorm room one day in April of 1968 when my dad called me. And as I say, his business was right in the heart of downtown, and that was right after that very week that Martin Luther King Jr. was killed.
Yeah.
And I'd never heard my dad's voice like it was that evening. It was shaking, and he told me that he had stood in his own window. His company was Wallpaper and Paint Company, and Capital Wallpaper and Paint Company. And but he was right across the street in downtown Northwest Washington from some of the large department stores. And he said, Bob, he said, men were coming around and breaking into the windows. We've seen this recently, but this was back in 1968, and just stealing the stuff out of the department stores. And he said, I watched them, and they were coming across the street. And as it began to get dark that afternoon, he said, I knew I needed to leave. He said, I said a prayer and opened the door to the alley behind the store where he parked the station wagon. And he said the alley was full of men and boxes stacked up. And so he shut and locked the door to the back of the store, and no one moved toward him. And he got in the vehicle and turned on the lights and started the engine. And he said the men just stepped aside and let him drive out of the alley. But the conversation we had that day, it was right before spring break, Easter weekend. And so three of us that came from the same area, we had been suite mates there. And as we drove down, we saw the armored personnel carriers and whatnot, vehicles around Baltimore. And then we came down to DC. We drove through the city and saw where 14th Street had been in ruins, and it was still smoking. And that Easter weekend, 1968, I spent literally hours driving around Washington, D.C., looking at 14th Street Northwest and 8th Street Southeast and Northeast, and just looking at the ruins that riot had made.
Wow.
And so I'll just kind of wrap up this part of the story by saying that when I went back to school that spring after that April weekend, I heard just clearly, you will not be in school next year. And when I've heard a voice like that, I always try to understand why I'm hearing it. And as I get some understanding, I've always been obedient. And so before I left school that spring of 68, I spoke to advisors and I said, if I don't return next year, what do I need to do? And the advisor said, well, he said, you're in good standing. I was in some leadership positions at school, and with national responsibilities, that's another part of that story and things I'd been exposed to. But he said, you can take a 1, 2, or 3 year leave of absence in good standing and return after the year, no questions asked. If you stay out more than 3 years, then you'll have to reapply.
You had already changed your major from engineering at that point, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Tell us about that. Yeah.
Well, it was a special study program dealing with Virginia and United States history. And so I moved from engineering and math-focused studies, what people were encouraging folks to do in those days was go into engineering and that kind of study, undergraduate, and then get a law degree, and you'll make a lot of money.
Right.
And so I just realized as I moved through the freshman year and into the sophomore year that I wanted a more liberal arts, human, people-oriented course of study. And I'll say briefly, I mean, I'm sure this very seldom, but I had a professor that sophomore year named John Knowles, whose book we had read in sophomore year of high school. It's called A Separate Peace.
Mm-hmm.
And he was a creative writing teacher that I had my sophomore year at Princeton. And I wrote something for him that I think was somewhat prophetic. And when we had they had precepts there, small groups that would meet with professors in larger classes, but this was a very small class. And when it came time to talk with the professor one-on-one about that particular story, in my case, he said, Bob, he said, this is a very interesting story. And he said, would you mind if I kept a copy of it? So that was also a kind of seminal conversation and event of that sophomore year.
Had you, were you leaning toward the ministry at that point?
Well, that was another time I'd heard something. And what I had heard at another time is you will be a minister, but not the pulpit kind.
Huh.
Just that clearly.
Right.
Said, well, Lord, what does that mean? And I didn't get a clear answer at that point, but later.
So what happened when you told your mom that you were going to take a leave of absence?
Well, those were Vietnam War days. And I had a pretty low draft number.
Wow.
My number was 121. And
Wow.
I had friends from high school that were being called up. And so my mom, thought I had literally gone crazy to face that. And so my dad, a very responsible businessman, he didn't call me crazy, but they were both concerned. So what she asked me, we always had a pretty good relationship. And she said, Bob, she thought about it as I was firm and indicated the conversation I'd had with advisors at school and everything. So she said, eventually she said, I'd like to make a deal with you. And I said, what's that? I respected my parents. And she said, well, I have selected two men who I think you would respect and appreciate. And I just wanted to ask you, my mom said, to meet with them. I will be with you and tell them what you're thinking to do. And with your draft number and leaving school. And so I agreed to do that. And so we had meetings with two men. One was a professor at Wesley Seminary in Washington, D.C. And the other was a pastor at a very unusual church called the Church of the Savior in Washington, D.C. And as a high school student, we had actually at one time visited the Potter's House, which grew out of a ministry of the Church of the Savior. It was the first church-sponsored coffee house in the whole country. And even Catherine Marshall, whose husband was the chaplain of the U.S. Senate, had written a book about her husband. And she had written a Reader's Digest article about the Potter's House and this pastor, Gordon Cosby. So those things, that was the two men, and I did respect them that she took me to talk some sense into me.
And I think that you the way you were sharing that with me is that your mom thought they were going to say, son, stay in school, go into the ministry, stay in school. She wasn't steering it that way, but she had picked two people she thought would give you that advice. And you went to those conversations with these two men. And here comes the Jubilee Housing part of the story with Gordon. That was
came later. This is 1968 now.
Right, not Jubilee, but the Church of the Savior part of it.
Right, yeah.
And that didn't happen. Both of them kind of affirmed your call from God.
Exactly. No, we had very good conversations. Each of the conversations with those men, my mom was present, were
Right.
lasted an hour. One was in the home of the seminary professor. The other was in Gordon Cosby's office on
On Massa.
Massachusetts Avenue,
Yeah.
DC. And
Yeah.
both of them said, uh, we understand the radical thing he's describing that he thinks he should do, but he's not crazy.
Right.
They
Right.
both said that.
So it sounds like you took this leave of absence and you obviously had to make a living. You did get drafted, I think you said, but didn't serve in Vietnam. So very
I,
fortunate.
I got a medical deferment.
Right.
Yep.
And then you found yourself working in property management, I believe. Is that right?
Well, I traveled and met some extraordinary people during a 3-year leave of absence. At the end of that time, I just was ready to get a job. Done a lot of traveling, and it was wonderful. But the job that I selected was a manual labor job at an apartment complex. It was
Hmm.
walking distance from where a group of young men lived at that point. And I applied for carpenter's helper. That position had just been filled, so I became the only white person on a large crew of yardmen and really just entry level maintenance. The apartment complex had over 900 apartments and a little shopping center. So that was the work I did after being out of school. They it was a wonderful environment, and again, learning about a large apartment complex from the ground up. And eventually I went back to school. I transferred into American University and decided at that point to study international studies.
Hmm.
All my Princeton credits transferred over, and the guys at the apartment complex said, don't even check out at a time clock. They said, just drive yourself to school for class and then come back. And so I had that job for several years.
Right. And then through your other positions in property management, what you had shared with me is something that I read about in an article in 1987. I mean, make sure I get this name of this magazine right, Apartment and Office Management News. And you were the cover story. And actually, when I look at that picture, that's how I think of us both, just still looking exactly that way. So we'll just go with that. And it tells the story of how your career in property management was going so well, but you really felt like you wanted to go deeper into your personal values. There's a lovely quote in the magazine article that says, "This is you were in the mid 70s being drawn to taking your professional skills and using them in a more service oriented way." And so let's talk a minute now about finding that bridge to Jubilee Housing. What happened there? How you obviously had met Gordon Cosby before, but now here comes Jim Rouse, Gordon Cosby, and others, and Barbara Moore and Terry Flood had already, and Carolyn Cresswell had already founded Jubilee Housing. So tell us a little bit about that story. What drew you there?
Well, the links are amazing, but just without going into any of that detail, I was working with a man whose father had been the manager for many years of that original apartment complex. And someone referred me to him, the son, who is now a senior property manager at a large property management company. And and she said, you might want to talk to this young man about being your assistant. So his name was Ralph Heisel. And one day we were talking and sitting out in the park, actually. And by that time, I had gone on to a third larger management company. We were still in touch, Ralph Heisel and I. We were having lunch together in a park in DC. And he said, Bob, he said, I was just invited to the Potter's house to hear Jim Rouse talk about Jubilee Housing. And he told me how that conversation had gone. I said, well, I've been to the Potter's house years ago. And tell me what he said about Jubilee Housing. So when he told me, I said, I would love to meet Jim Rouse and learn about Jubilee Housing myself. So we did that. Ralph Heisel followed up that fundraising event at the Potter's House with Jim Rouse and said, I have this young man, could we come out and visit you in Columbia, Maryland? So we did. We went out, met Jim Rouse in his office in Columbia, Maryland, and it was a wonderful conversation about Jubilee Housing and his interest in it. And Carolyn Banker Cresswell had told her involvement in those earliest days, 73, but we sort of hit it off. And I was active in the Washington, D.C. chapter of the Metropolitan Washington chapter of the Institute of Real Estate Management. And I asked Jim, I said, would you be open to speaking about Jubilee Housing at a meeting of the Institute of Real Estate Management? These were folks from all kinds of property management and real estate that were in this organization, meeting in big hotels downtown. And he said, yes, I would do that if you let me bring some of the Jubilee people. So Jim, and that was when I first met Patty Rouse, came to that dinner and brought Terry Flood and Barbara Moore with him. Bill Branner, of course, was in the picture. And it was a wonderful evening. I got to introduce Jim as the speaker. And I was sitting next to Patty Ross, though. And toward the end of the conversation there at the table at that meeting where Jim had spoken about Jubilee Housing and asked Barbara and Terry to speak about it too, Patty said to me, kind of as we were getting ready to walk out, she said, Bob, she said, Jim is now talking, Jim Rouse is talking with Jim Clark from Clark Construction Companies. And Jubilee Housing, this is about 5 years, not quite 5 years at this point, from the start of Jubilee Housing, the acquisition of the Ritz and Mozart. Getting ready, they know those buildings need a renovation. And between Jim Rouse and Jim Clark, we have a group of companies that are offering to come alongside and support this effort. She said, is there any chance you might be interested in coordinating that? And she and I were walking out beside each other at this meeting, and I said, well, and we talked that whole dinner time together. I said, I'd be open to that. So the next thing was a meeting with Jim Rouse again. And he explained what we're prepared to do is hire you at the Rouse Company and donate you to be the director of what we're suggesting would be called the Jubilee Support Group. And originally it had these 6 companies, and including a law firm, an accounting firm, architectural firm, Rouse Company, Clark Construction. And that was what I was hired by the Rouse Company in order to sit right there in Jubilee Housing office and bring these professionals to work on the renovation plan and then renovate the Ritz and Mozart.
Clearly the mission was reaching out to you, was pertinent to what you said about wanting a more deeply service-oriented position somewhere.
Well, and right in the heart of an extraordinary ministry and,
right.
and the Church of the Savior. And that's what that 1 year arrangement was renewed 11 times. It lasted 12 years and then launched into what followed that.
And what was it like? What was Adams Morgan like in those days? What were the Jubilee buildings like?
Well, for those that might have heard Carolyn Cresswell's story, she told it beautifully and accurately. By that time, the buildings were decades old. They were built in the teens. Beautiful, beautiful buildings when they were built. And now they were literally slums. I mean, literally the elevators didn't work, and the buildings were full of trash and not just worn out. I mean, they were vandalized and painted up and so forth. It was quite a scene. But before I arrived, in that 5 years intervening from the time the buildings were bought until the Jubilee Support Group was created to renovate those buildings, the most powerful, what is now referred to as relational ministry, had taken place. And people in what they called a mission group from the Church of the Savior, Terry, Barbara, Carolyn, had been the keys to launching that with others, just got to know the residents and honored them, respected them, and created activities and programs that involved the residents. And And so there was already, a relational, beautiful thing going when I was brought in. And what, I was able to do was suggest that we actually employ as many residents, because there'd be a lot of manual labor and entry-level skill type opportunities in this extensive renovation that would take place. We had to renovate with residents in place.
Mhm.
And so what we did, one building was 5 stories tall, the other was 6 stories tall, and we would had to have and they had back-to-back plumbing. And I'll be as brief as I can. We had to clear 2 tiers, 2 risers of apartments where the kitchens and baths plumbing joined in the wall. So we had to have 10 or 12 apartments as we went through the Mozart or the Ritz that would be vacant. And we accumulated those vacancies as we prepared to do the renovation. And then we would renovate 5 or 10 or 12 apartments at a time, 10 in the Mozart, 12 in the Ritz. And one resident named Robert Lane became the construction coordinator for the resident employees. And I'll just say one more little detail. There's so many things that were fascinating, but we were obligated because we were using a $1.8 million grant that Jim Rouse had arranged with HUD. And we had to pay Davis-Bacon wage rates. And so what we had to do, which were extremely high wage rates, even for labor. And so I said, that won't work. And so what we had to do was create part-time jobs that allowed us to employ more residents at for a reasonable number of hours, where this high wage that we had to pay was not an extraordinary income that we knew, frankly, and that's another topic here, would disrupt lives and lifestyles.
And I believe this was during the time when DC was known as the murder capital of the world too, or maybe that was a little bit later on. But
no, that was emerging then, and it wasn't.
I know this from the years we were together back in the 80s. There were some very fraught times with you leading these efforts and the renovation and additional buildings being bought. And I remember you talking a lot about some of the dangerous activities that were going on, drugs in the building. Right. How would you characterize that moment from a relational mission,
right,
relational commitment, if you will, to community, yep, and also the serious nature of very dangerous activities going on even in the buildings?
Well, I mean, takes us into another huge part of the story. By that time, my wife Marla was working in the midst of the Jubilee Ministries as well, first at Columbia Road Health Services and eventually at Jubilee Housing too. And we had 3 very young children. As the drug, related activity increased, and Washington, D.C. was known in those days. This is, as we moved into the early 80s, as the murder capital of the country, just like later Chicago and other places have been. And there was tremendous violence. And I was not drafted, as we've already mentioned, but I tell the guys that I know now who were in those Vietnam days, I didn't go to Vietnam, but I saw a lot of blood.
Wow.
And I saw dead bodies.
Wow.
Even children's bodies. And a couple of times I went to court because I wanted to see what happened in court at the end result of some of the things that we had to deal with. But my wife Marla, when she worked at Columbia Road Health Services, one of the Jubilee related ministries, was mugged one time, her purse snatched. That was a tough time for our family. And another time, and without going into details, we had a foundation, a whole board of one major foundation coming to visit us. And I went out to the parking lot that one of our residents managed and observed that it was a van was being robbed. And very unusual for me, I had on a coat and tie and I had boulders in my hand. But I could see this gentleman leaving the parking lot, going down into an alleyway, and unwisely and obviously foolishly, in retrospect, I followed him, and it wasn't long before I had a fist in my face, and then stumbled out to the sidewalk, and I was lying, thankfully, face down on the ground as he was stomping and kicking my head.
Oh my gosh.
And so
What
that took me out of commission for a little while.
But
But
you stayed, and
yeah,
you're feeling this call. What kept you there? You have wife and little kids. What kept you there, Bob?
well, I think the wife and little kids, we Gordon, Bill, Terry, Barbara, the people that, so many people might have known and heard of, we knew the residents. We loved them. They loved us. And so one of the things we did during that period was organized where we would march against drugs. And you talk about being foolish. We played gospel music through a bullhorn and had signs that said, "This is a neighborhood, not a drugstore, and you're being prayed for by people who care." Those, I can still remember what was written on these placards that we carried around. We marched around the block of Richard Mozart one night, and we were escorted. We weren't dumb. We had relationships with the police. A motorcycle police officer would usually accompany us. One night he was late, and we went on ahead, because as it was getting dusky, dark and then darker. And that night that we didn't have a police officer with us, and our three little children, they were all under 6 years old. We had rocks thrown at us by some of the drug dealers standing on the other side of the street. So again, they were dark days with relationships of love and respect and mutuality that were just, we felt like the Lord had led us to be there. And we had no problem deciding we were meant to stay. And by that time, family members were more accustomed to that kind of understanding.
And I've heard so many stories too. This was about the time I was coming into Jubilee Housing, about how the residents of the buildings and the founders were in a very trusting relationship by and large. And the fact that it was so relational and people were making decisions all together is what I hear is making a huge difference. There were also in those years some really amazing celebratory things, also some events and activities that happened. Name a couple that come to mind that you just really, really cherish now.
Well, they came in all sizes. I mean, we had people like you, Myra, in the business community with all kinds of discipline and experience join in our midst. At one point, and again, Jim Rouse knew so many people, business people and political people. And so when Jimmy Carter was president, Rosalind was on our committee of support, and her name was on that roster, and that was sent out in certain communications. And Jimmy Carter visited one of the buildings, the Ontario Court building, and I can still remember as we prepared for that, and the black vehicle drove up Ontario Road in the middle of Adamsburg, in the neighborhood where a lot of this stuff was still going on. I had to, arrange with the resident in one of the first floor apartments, could the Secret Service officers change into their stuff, in your apartment? They said, absolutely, use the bedroom here. And they climbed up the fire escape onto the roof. And Jimmy Carter spoke, from one of the Ontario Court stairways outside the building there. Had a crowd of our residents, but one resident, Linda Standback, was a gifted, and many gifts among the residents, many gifts. Linda Standback was a poet, truly a gifted poet.
I remember her, and she was on the board. She was on the board of Jubilee.
She was one of a number of Jubilee residents on the board. And so she gave President Carter a couple of poems that she had written, and they were powerful. And one of them he signed a thank you back to her, and signed it, just his name. And of course, she shared copies of that. I still have a copy of that poem. That's just one example of countless, Sylvia. You were a part of many of those, and We had visitors of all sorts, and the residents were always front and center as part of the team. As the drug violence got more serious, and there were some residents who had sons usually who were drug dealers and brought money into the home. They say there was violence, either for non-payment of rent, which is another story there's not time to tell, because we realize it's important that people do pay their rent, but also to enforce leases if people are violating the lease, like selling drugs out of their apartment. We passed the word respectfully, those families will be evicted. And so we had to go to court with some very dramatic cases sometimes. And that one of the law firms that was in the Jubilee support group that I coordinated, we generally were working with associates and so forth, but one of these cases related to drugs and violence was very, very serious. And so one of the senior attorneys of that law firm is Wald Hartgrader and Ross. I was in touch with him. And just to create or touch on one little loop here, Myra, his name was Mark Lakritz. And my sophomore year at Princeton, he had been a senior and he was president of student government. And here we were, where he's the senior law firm. He was also one of the attorneys that was involved in the Nixon Watergate thing. He had been a Rhodes Scholar after he graduated from Princeton. So here he was now one of the senior partners at one of the Jubilee support group law firms.
Wow.
And he was in The Hague, at the International Court, the night before. And he took a red-eye flight to get back to Washington, D.C. to meet not with a judge, but with one of the hearing examiners for one of the cases that we were dealing with drugs.
Wow.
And he and I would chat in his office, and I mean, that's just a little loop.
Right.
Years separated, all the experiences where he was a part of this Jubilee support group too.
Well, I want to touch briefly on the real gift you gave to me. I look at you and I think you just changed my life in such a significant way, Bob. Jim Rouse and you and others, I guess, had decided to try to expand the business community involvement in Jubilee Housing. And Jim invited me and a wonderful man named Knox Spanner, head of the DC Department of Business and Economic Development, to meet with the two of you. And I remember we were back steps up above Columbia Road Health Center, I think. And I heard you say some words that really did change my life. I heard you talk about Jubilee Housing as working with community and with people who lived in the buildings, not for. And I had learned that lesson when I worked for Mayor Maynard Jackson, the first Black mayor of Atlanta, when I was right out of college. Learned that lesson in some very powerful ways, that we need to work with, not paternalistically for. And in my neighborhood housing services days, the same lesson. So I knew I wanted some volunteerism that had that approach, and I had never found it. So we were sitting in that little office, and of course it was amazing to be with Jim Rouse. I was very flattered to have been asked by him, and you started talking about that. And I remember thinking this was God at work, that this was what was my opportunity. And it was because of that approach. And it seems to have continued. It has continued for me. I've been a volunteer ever since at Jubilee Housing. And for you, it has been your through thread. It's how you approach everything you do. So we're going to go now, and I'm going to ask you about the new call, because I was pretty much standing right near you when this was happening, when you were called to go across the Anacostia River, east of the river, and into Anacostia with Jubilee Enterprise. Tell us just a little bit about that.
Well, in the work of Jubilee, we were, of course, connected with, so many people throughout Washington, D.C., like you said, both in political and business areas, and also among the different nonprofits and churches. And so I had friends that were working out east of the river, as we call it, Anacostia and southeast Washington on the other side of the Anacostia River. And they said, Bob, they said, these are larger, multifamily apartment complexes, sometimes hundreds of units. And people are they're being, distressed. Um, they're being impacted by the drug business and violence, and people are being displaced right and left. They said, we really need what Jubilee is doing out here. And so I'll never forget the meeting we had in Jubilee Housing. We had an executive committee, and my wife Myra was on at that point too. And I wish there was more time to tell more, but at that meeting, I shared this. I said, I really am feeling called to respond to this need on the other side of the Anacostia River. Is it possible? And this was my sincere proposal. Is it possible that Jubilee Housing could reach out beyond this Adams Morgan neighborhood and that we could become involved even in east of the river? And it was a very powerful conversation that day. Several of us, Gordon, Terry, Barbara, Bill Branner, Marla, and me, and executive committee. And we discussed it seriously. Now, there have been things at home, Marla's in my conversation, there have been prayer, but the other people who we dearly loved and respected, I'd been there almost 12 years at that point, said, Bob, we can't expand that way and do what we're called to do. And so I heard them and respected that. And that led to the creation. By that time, Jim and Patty had created the Enterprise Foundation. And it had been operating for a number of years at that point. And I had been blessed to work and go, to numerous national meetings that Enterprise had done. And there's no time to tell the story of that. But we worked closely with the Enterprise Foundation, and we created a new nonprofit. It was called Jubilee Enterprise of Greater Washington. And Myra, you were a big part of that.
Went right with you.
And we started with some of those apartment complexes that had become distressed, to put it mildly. We ended up over the course of 11 years working with the residents. In some cases, they were already active. In other cases, we activated them. And we created a separate nonprofit corporation. We called it a neighborhood corporation in each of 5 different places. The first one was 259 apartments, and a woman who had been a leader among the residents out there became the president of the neighborhood corporation, Katie Fitzgerald.
Fitzgerald, right.
Yeah. And you knew her and these people. And we ultimately developed 5 such sites with a total of over 1,300 apartments. And the residents were on the board, they were empowered. We were dealing with more than one of those properties had 1 or 2 murders within the week before we went to settlement on the property, just drug related. So again, we didn't escape the problems of Northwest Washington. They had calmed down again a bit by that time. But we moved into another place where there was tremendous challenge. And that lasted for me 11 years. You were a big part of that, Myra.
Right. And again, the through thread for me there in your commitment to sharing power to leadership roles for residents, for decisions being made by people who lived in these buildings, not decisions being made by us or people who were not living in those buildings. And it was very powerful. And I'll just say this personally, I don't think I've said this to you. When I was asked to come and chair the Jubilee Housing Board again a few years later, those lessons stayed with me. And making decisions, I mean, obviously I was a businesswoman, so spreadsheets matter and cash projections matter and cash flow matters. And we would have an opportunity you were on the board with me, so you watched me deal with this. at Jubilee Housing an opportunity to buy, and I would look at all the numbers and say, no, that just can't happen. And the residents around the table would say, how could we not? How could we not do this? We must do this. And the faith aspect of planning just was so powerful in those meetings. And you kept that there. You were part of it from the beginning with the others. And it's just made so much difference to so many different lives. And now I need to take you down to Virginia because you moved, and Faith Works has the same thing. You have been in service all these years. You've never wavered. You've kept that commitment to being and doing with, not for. I want to ask you what advice you would give to people who want to participate in Jubilee Housing, of people who want to make a difference just like you have. What advice would you give these days?
Well, it's amazing if you have a conversation along the lines of some of what you and I have been chatting about today. It's actually surprising how many people, no matter what profession they're in, what experience they've had, especially people of faith, say, I'd love to have an opportunity to do something like that, to meet those kinds of people and make a difference, whatever. And so to be in a place where you can actually open that kind of door for people to be engaged, you're answering their prayer. Mm-hmm. And that's what I found. And now FaithWorks, you mentioned, followed the 12 years of Jubilee Housing, 11 years of Jubilee Enterprise, and now it's been over 20 years of FaithWorks. FaithWorks, the way I described it at the outset, was simply had the capacity to do serious community development, housing and facilities for services to the residents of the places where the housing is. But to come alongside churches and other nonprofits who didn't know how to do that. And so we began in Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia, and served many, many churches and nonprofits. Some of the projects were very substantial and very costly. But again, the heart of it was exactly what you and I have been talking about for the last several minutes, of engaging the people that they are there to serve. Sometimes, like with Arlington County government, we worked in a whole neighborhood, Knock community, right off 95.
Wow. And
it had numerous churches in that neighborhood. It was primarily an African-American community. And so we were revitalizing a whole neighborhood in Arlington in a project that was very exciting. Other times it was a building. Sometimes they had just bought land or had land and were saying, this is our vision. How can we accomplish it? So that's what FaithWorks has done with literally dozens of contracts or groups, efforts over the last 20-some years.
Wow. And the people who do pull up to the table, if they pull up to the table with you, they need to have, I think, the attitude that no one is better than anybody else. And with the gifts we bring, no matter who we are at these tables, are the gifts that are going to make things work. And I've just watched you do that. And it's beautiful. I want to close by asking you what gives you hope these days. I know we all spend a lot of time worrying about the divides, the issues that are pulling us apart instead of together. You have such a strong faith. As a new grandmother, I know that I have to mention your grandchildren is something who would give you faith. So, but I'll let you answer that question. What gives you hope these days, Bob?
Well, since you mentioned family, now we're blessed with 7 grandchildren. Now we have six grandsons and 1 princess, and so that is a blessing, family. And then, I mean, just today, I've had 3 prior to this extraordinary conversation with you, Myra. I've had 3 amazing conversations just in one day. 2 with people who were engaged in very, very interesting ministry in this northern Shenandoah Valley area. And then one person who I haven't heard from in years just called me out of the blue today, and we reconnected. And so it's that depth of relationship. Just a couple of nights ago, I was in, I guess it was last night, I was in a meeting, something called Family Promise. It's a national ministry, and we have started one in Shenandoah County and one in Winchester, in sort of the counties. And again, it's working with those families, homeless families with children and living in motels, and just heartbreaking situations. But again, like I say, if you're doing this stuff, people love to be able to just volunteer and come into the midst of it and help and participate in the miracles.
Well, I just want to say thank you. I think didn't plan this one, but thank you for not retiring. And Marla, just continue to give and to make such differences, and I admire you for it, and I'm very grateful. I thank you for the changes that your work has made. You mentioned to me yesterday that it is now a federal law at HUD that a community development organization has to have leadership roles, people on the boards, literally from the community they serve. That's called CHODO, and Jubilee Housing is a CHODO organization. But we had residents on the board from the beginning, not because it was something required, but now it's required. That's sea change.
That's an example of how Jubilee Housing has been a model.
Yeah.
Federal guidelines now.
Yeah, it's great. So thank you for those changes. And then thank you sincerely for our friendship. You mean so much to me. And lastly, thank you for helping us celebrate these 50 years. It's amazing, and your voice is so meaningful. So Bob, thank you very much, and we'll talk again soon.
It's mutual, Myra. Thank you.